Morning, all. All right, so we're going to have a discussion that I do believe I've had on this channel before. Canadian teams and their ability to hold on to star players, their ability to get guys to play their whole careers north of the border or play with one franchise or stay in Canada. And this is now becoming a discussion again because of Goudreau and Kachuk likely going to the States. I don't get that upset with it because I understand, like, if you're American born, you want to play in the States. I understand. I get it. And there are reasons for that. You know, it is expensive to live in Canada, and taxes are pretty high. The one thing is that, of course, for Canadian teams, the biggest headache is that we Canadian customers pay in Canadian dollars. They pay their players and their staff in American dollars. It's a big difference there. Currently, the US dollar is worth $1.29 Canadian, or if you're converting a Canadian dollar to an American dollar, it's 78 cents US. Now, as a YouTuber who's paid in US dollars, that can make a huge difference. From one month to the next, it can make an absolutely huge difference when the Canadian dollar goes up or goes down. So, yeah, being paid in US dollars on the Canadian side of the border, it can be very wildly unpredictable, which might be part of it for players as well. When the Canadian dollar gets really strong, suddenly they might be losing 10-15% off their paychecks, and their costs haven't gone down, right? We've seen as most recent numbers I've seen, you know, the inflation is 7.7% in Canada, 9% in the US, though, so for what that's worth. But of course, you do have lower taxes, and there's other things too, you know, and players will cite like media pressure and just that pressure of playing in Canada. And I've talked about this. I've talked about this for years, that I've kind of felt like at times Canadian franchises, markets might be their own worst enemies. Sometimes I see the criticism of players and of staff and of just people around the organization, and I think it's unwarranted. It's over the top. It's just far too critical, and it's this oddity that happens more with the Canadian teams than it does with the American teams. You can go down to play in Dallas, and I would think you could probably walk around in public and people won't know who you are. But if you're a Canuck, if you're a Maple Leaf, that's quite different. And so the anonymity has to be nice for the players as well, right? And then you're making the same amount of money. You're probably paying less in taxes, and you might be able to afford a nicer home. The home housing market in Canada in general is absolutely ridiculous right now. And in Vancouver, it is exceedingly expensive. So even for a National Hockey League player coming in, they may not be able to afford a home, or they might look and say, this is $3 million. I'm not paying $3 million for this. So, right. And so it's all part and parcel of what's going on. Now, people have talked about the border restrictions. I'm sure the border restrictions are part of this as well. And again, it just gets added. You're always going to be coming at this from an inferior perspective, Canadian wise. And it's definitely something that's bothered Canadians for a long time. I made peace with that in the early mid 90s when we saw guys leaving Canadian franchises and going south of the border because of a lot of reasons. And really, Canadian franchises could not bid for some of these players because of the discrepancy between the Canadian and the American dollar. At one point, the Canadian dollar was down as low as, I think it was 64 cents US was the lowest it got, I think. But 66, I know it got down to at least 66. So right now, with it being 78 cents, yeah, and that was part of the reason why we lost the Winnipeg Jets. That's part of the reason we lost the Quebec Nordiques in the early mid 90s. Is just the fact that it was a small market in Quebec City and Winnipeg, combined with the low Canadian dollar, and then trying to find players who wanted to play in those markets too was becoming more and more of a challenge. There were mismanagement issues, sure, and we can talk about mismanagement issues when it comes to Canadian teams, but just the small market Canada wasn't as attractive to them as going down and playing in Dallas or playing for what was the Stanley Cup winning Detroit Red Wings franchise, which is also something that can help mitigate this. In the case of Toronto, in the case of Edmonton, currently they have, you know, some of the best players in the National Hockey League. You will be able to find guys who want to go and play there. But if we look at, and this was just a cursory glance I took over, looked over rosters. In red underline, I've got American-born players on Canadian franchises who've signed contracts recently. There's Coleman, there's Rooney with Calgary, so they've both gone to Calgary. Hanifin is still there. Kachuk is still, of course, officially a member of the roster. If he makes his exit, he makes his exit. But Hanifin's still there. With the Oilers, you have Derek Ryan, who, of course, Spokane, Washington. People figured, well, he'll go to Seattle. He didn't. Yamamoto and Jack Campbell. Jack Campbell, American-born goaltender, going from Toronto to Edmonton, showing that there are some players who are like, yeah, no, the fishbowl thing, I'm fine with that, and I'm fine with being, critiqued and all that. And I think in Edmonton it might be a little bit easier for him than it was in Toronto on a couple of fronts, but he's still going to get plenty of criticism if he has, a couple of rough games here and there. Montreal, they have Dvorak, they have Rem Pitlick, who just re-signed there. Caulfield, of course, American-born, and Ylonen. And there could come a point where Cole Caulfield's like, I want to go and play in California. I want to go and play in Michigan. I want to play wherever. But the reality is, you take that chance. It's not much different to me than picking up Russian players and the fact that eventually they might go to the KHL. Maybe they don't come over. There's that risk there. And other European-born players, you're going to have those risks too. Then you have Ottawa. Ottawa, to me, is one that really stands out amongst this discussion right now. That's why I'm wearing Ottawa. You have Dylan Gambrell, who's staying there. Josh Norris just signed an 8-year contract in Ottawa. So whatever Pierre Dorion is doing is working. It is convincing these players to stay and be a part of something. Shane Pinto, Alex DeBrincat, who they just acquired in a trade with Chicago, Austin Watson, Jake Sanderson, who's coming in as a rookie, and most importantly to me is Brady Tkachuk. Because while people are looking at Matthew Tkachuk and saying, see, they don't want to stay here, the same thing was said of Brady Tkachuk, and then he re-signed in Ottawa for a long-term extension when the rumor was, well, maybe he's not going to stay, and maybe he's just going to want a short-term contract, and then he'll be off to St. Louis. Because if your name's Tkachuk, immediately people are going to say St. Louis. For Toronto, of course, you have Abruzzese. You have Gaudette, who just signed in Toronto. Justin Hall, Matthews, and of course, yes, there's the 2024 countdown. But at that point, it'll be 8 years from when Toronto drafted Matthews. This is part of the conversation, too, to me, which is, okay, but they were here a long time. Johnny Gaudreau was in the Calgary organization a long time. He earned the right to go somewhere else. And this is part of the thing, right? You have to make it so that your franchise is the most attractive. You do have more hurdles to overcome, absolutely, but that's always been the case. This isn't something that suddenly sprouted up where, oh, now guys don't want to play in Canada. Quelle surprise. Nick Robertson, American-born as well. But again, Matthews, that's the big one. And just if they win a Stanley Cup in 2023, it'll be easier to convince them to stick around for a while longer and sign a long-term extension with them. That's part of it too, is, and it's that whole issue you're going to have, which is, so winning a Stanley Cup can help you hold on to your players. Teams in Canada haven't won a Stanley Cup since 1993, so they haven't had that carrot they can dangle out there to bring guys in or keep guys there, and it just kind of keeps going that way. And on top of the Canadian dollar being low and all that other fun stuff, then you go to Vancouver. You've got Brock Besser, who just signed a 3-year extension, although I keep hearing, oh, they just signed that so they could trade him. Okay, sure, fine, whatever. Connor Garland, who signed an extension with Vancouver last summer. Quinn Hughes did the same. The thing that I laughed about, and I still do, is that as soon as Quinn Hughes signs that extension through 2027, the first reaction being, great, now he's leaving in 2027. The inferiority complex with Canadian fans. Tyler Myers is American. Tucker Pullman's American. Colin Delia, who just signed with Vancouver, may end up being in the mix for the backup, is American. And Thatcher Demko is American as well. So there's the possibility at some point that Vancouver could have problems. But I think Vancouver does a good job in its treatment of players. And I mean, I have some knowledge of things when it comes to Vancouver players off the ice and all of that. And I think Vancouver does pretty well in how it treats its players. And maybe you have to provide a few extra perks if you're a Canadian team over an American rival. Then you have Winnipeg. You have Appleton. You have Kyle Connor, of course, a long-term extension there. Blake Wheeler's been in Winnipeg for ages. Neil Pionk signed an extension with the Jets. Nate Schmidt went from Vancouver to Winnipeg. Hey, he did have to be talked into it, but he did go. And Connor Hellebuck, goaltender for the Winnipeg Jets. We can't imagine him being anywhere else. And so there are American players on Canadian rosters. You're always going to have this problem. And I see people posting about government system. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's in charge. It doesn't matter what kind of policies are being put in place. It really does come down to some players would prefer to play in certain markets, and for Canadian franchises, they're always kind of working from this this level where they're below a lot of the other American markets. And that is part of the reason why Canada doesn't win Stanley Cups. And I've talked about that there are a lot of factors as to why American franchises win Stanley Cups and Canadian ones don't. Although there are American franchises who struggle as well when it comes to attracting players. There are, of course, the arena issues in Calgary that are, lingering around the franchise. I think Calgary would make more money if they got their new building. I think Calgary would make a lot more money. And so, the other oddity with the NHL is, even though the Canadian dollar is as low as it is, Canadian franchises generated, and this is, I want to say 3 years ago, 32% of the NHL's revenues at the gate came from the 7 Canadian markets. So it is a lot of money that Canada generates. And we, of course, are, I'm doing hockey videos 365 days a year, but Canadian franchises are up against it, and that's a reality. You will always have players wanting to sign in Toronto. I think you'll always have players wanting to sign in Montreal, and I think Vancouver will always have that. And as long as you have good competitive rosters, as long as you have a good general manager who knows what he's doing, other Canadian markets will be fine as well. And the reason I mentioned Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, they're the largest Canadian markets. And there was a point in the 90s where the reality was both Alberta teams were on life support. They were seen as being next. When the Jets and then the Hurricanes left, and that was after the Nordiques had left, Gary Bettman said the problem in the NHL was 3 letters, WHA, which led to Oiler fans completely panicking because they were the only ones left that hadn't been moved. So they didn't get moved, but there was real discussion at the time of whether or not, the Houston Oilers might happen, right? And for Calgary, there were discussions about whether or not they'd move. Not only that, but I remember late 90s, a discussion of whether or not the Canucks might eventually end up in Seattle because they were losing money too. So as rough as things are right now, and they are rough for some franchises, I'm encouraged by the fact that Vancouver has a lot of American-born players. They also have JT Miller, which I didn't put on the board. I should have Miller on the board. And of course, the discussion of whether or not Miller wants to stay. I think it's the same discussion we've had in Canada for a very long time. Star players wanting to sign long-term extensions in the States. Connor McDavid, it's great that he signed that long-term extension with the Oilers because in general, that is the exception rather than the rule. Star players will very often want to go south of the border and play there. And it's not going to change. It is not going to change. There's no magical formula to fixing it. And unless everything on this side of the border changed, and even then, as I said too, I can understand if you're an American-born player wanting to be near your hometown. I find that odd that people get mad when a guy decides he wants to go home. Like the big thing with Matthews is, what if he wants to go to Arizona? Well, what if he wants to go to Arizona? What if he wants to play around where he grew up? What if he wants to play around where, his family is? I don't really have an issue with that, and I don't view that as a negative thing. I've talked about how, it's nice when the Canucks draft a guy who's from Vancouver. We've got Abbotsford-born players playing for the Abbotsford Canucks, and it's nice. It's nice that, and I imagine it's nice for them too. You go to the rink, you play your game, and then you go home, and it's your home. And it doesn't change in the off season, and you don't have to worry about multiple homes or figuring out another market. Teams are pretty good at helping out players with making sure that their schooling's all set up and everything else is all set up. All that off-ice stuff, NHL teams are pretty good about helping them out with. But again, some players are going to choose to play on the southern side of the border, and it will make it more difficult for Canadian teams to win the Stanley Cup. And it is part of the factor in why Canadian teams don't win Stanley Cups. And again, I've talked about it on this channel going back to, I want to say the first time I would have done a video on this would have been at least 5 years ago, where I was talking about Canada and attracting players and all that fun stuff. So it really is on a general manager then to figure out a way to keep things going and to keep a franchise relevant and to stay in a position to become a contender, while being aware that you're drafting players who may not stick around with the organization when they can get to unrestricted free agency. But again, it is something that we've been dealing with for a very long time. So I just find it weird because right now in the media, it's being treated like it's this new thing or it's something we haven't talked about before. We've been talking about this for ages. since Gretzky went to L.A., we've been talking about this, and Gretzky, I felt bad about that at the time because everybody blamed Janet Jones. Well, he married an actress. Of course, he's going to want to go to L.A. He wanted to go to Detroit. He was also willing to go to Vancouver, and she took all the blame because, well, his wife's an actress, and there you go. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.